Hi, thanks for tuning in for another in a series of videos on how to replace or upgrade the bearings in your Align T-Rex 450 Pro helicopter. Now, since the last time I made a video, I piled my 450 in pretty good, and as you can see, my main shaft is really bent up, and I've got some pretty significant damage. So for this video, what I'm going to do is show you how to replace the two bearings in your main bearing blocks on your main shaft here. Now, in my particular case, that main shaft is so bent that I expect that I'll have a lot of difficulty getting those bearings off that shaft if there's any bending internally here, which is a good possibility. And then also, because there's been so much trauma to this main shaft, those bearings are probably shot, so it's a good idea to replace those anyway. So what I'm going to do is pull my head off, pull my swash plate off, and then I probably am going to have to pull those bearing blocks out of the helicopter and work on getting those bearings out, and they'll probably stay on that damaged shaft. So what I've got here is two more bearings from Boca Bearings. Again, they were good enough to send me these upgraded bearings to show you how to do that replacement. So first thing I'm going to do is pull my head and my swash plate off, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I got my rotor head off, and what I found is that this shaft is so bent that I can't even get this swash plate off, so that's going to be a challenge for another time. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to straighten this shaft out enough to get the swash plate off, or just call it a loss and get a new swash plate. But for now, what I'm going to do is pull my main gear out and use your 1.5 millimeter hex driver to pull this Jesus bolt out. Pull that out with a pair of pliers there. Now, if all goes well, I can pull the shaft straight out, and I don't think I will be able to because it's pretty bent. Yeah, so that's stuck in there. Okay, now I got some pretty serious disassembly to do. What I'm going to do is pull out this top bearing block and this bottom bearing block, and hopefully be able to figure out how to get this thing apart with all that bending in there. And again, your 1.5 millimeter hex driver to get these screws out. Now the top bearing block also has your canopy posts installed in that middle hole there. You're going to have to pull those out as well. But for now, I'm going to get all my screws out of my bearing block. And once I get that done, I'll turn the camera back on and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so I've got all the screws and my canopy post pulled out of my main bearing blocks. I've got my elevator servo removed because that actually attaches to the bearing blocks as well. Now, with all that disassembled, I believe there's enough wiggle room to pull this main shaft out far enough. So I can get my main gear out. There it goes. So I got my main gear out. I've got my main shaft now, and it looks like that's the top bearing block, and I might be real lucky. Yeah, okay, so that comes off there. So this is the top bearing block. Now, depending on what model T-Rex 450 you have, you might have a main bearing block on the top that separates like this. This is for ease of taking out these cyclic servos without having to take out the entire front of your helicopter. Now the bottom bearing block, again with those screws taken out, should slide right out. Now you want to be real careful when you reassemble these things. This bottom bearing block, the bearing, the recess that this bearing sits in, when you push it in, goes down in the helicopter. The top bearing block, when you put that new bearing in through the top, that sits upright. So when you put your main shaft back on, you have this top bearing facing up, you have this bottom bearing facing down. Now, in previous applications, I haven't used a retaining compound with these bearings, but these two bearings, you're going to want to use a retaining compound to seat that in that bearing block, because what can happen is you take your main shaft out and that bearing will drop out of this bearing block and you run into some problems. So for bearing blocks, make sure you use a retaining compound to seat those bearings in there good so that they're not going to fall out. Now to get the bearings, these old bearings out of the bearing blocks, what you can try and do is use your hex driver that has this little lip here, this little tapered lip. Put it in this side here and try and push it out. If it does start sliding out like mine does, sometimes you can work it out. You can use an old main shaft and kind of push it out. If you're not worried about the bearings, you can jam that out of there pretty good and it pops out. If your bearing is stuck, if it's got retaining compound in there, you're going to use a heat source like a lighter or a torch. Heat up this aluminum. It expands faster than the steel. It also breaks down that retaining compound and helps you get that out. You can also put these metal pieces in the oven at about 250 degrees for 10 minutes or so, and you get that same expansion. So I've got these out. You're going to want to clean out these recesses here. There's a little bit of gunk in there from the retaining compound. I'm going to clean those out. You can use an all-purpose gunk cleaner. Some people use alcohol with a Q-tip and get those real clean so that your new bearings seat real good. So I'm going to clean those out, and we'll stick the new bearings in and start the reassembly. Okay, so I've got my bearing blocks all cleaned out. I've got my replacement bearings from Boca. You're going to need 2 of these, and the number is MR685-ZZ if you want to order these from Boca Bearings. Now, what I do is I take my retaining compound, thread lock, Zap, a bunch of different companies make a retaining compound, put a little bit on a toothpick, and just enough to coat the inside of that bearing block. And real carefully make sure you got that nice and straight before you push it in, and seat that bearing in there. And that goes in. We'll do the same thing for this bearing block and get them back into the helicopter. So we're ready to put these bearing blocks back into the helicopter. And again, when you reinstall these, make sure that you put them in the right way. The bearing direction that you installed it in, the lower bearing block faces down, and that slides in between the frames there and gets secured with 4 screws. And again, make sure you use your thread lock and all those metal to metal connections there. And then the top bearing block, again, the direction that you inserted the bearing goes up. And that will fit down into your frames. And again, if you have the 2-piece bearing block, the newer version from Align, there's a little connection between the front part of the block and the back part of the block there. So we'll go ahead and get our screws reinstalled to get those back into the helicopter. Okay, one more point of note while you're putting this back together. Before you cinch down all those screws around your bearing blocks, what you want to do is take your new main shaft and slide it down between those bearings and make sure everything's all lined up before you cinch all that stuff down. Now obviously with a new shaft, the Align logo there goes down into the helicopter. And what you can do is slide that down between the 2 bearings and make sure that that's all nice and straight, and then go ahead and reinstall your screws. Another point is whenever you're replacing a main shaft like this, it's a good idea, even though your Jesus bolts that attach the head and the main gears to that shaft, they may look okay. It's always a good idea to use the new ones in your package so that you know they're nice and straight and strong, and there's not going to be a chance of those things shearing off and causing you some problems. So I got my main shaft nice and straight through there. I'll go ahead and put all my screws back on my bearing blocks, and I'll be done with the bearing reinstallation on this thing. Now, obviously, because I had such a horrendous crash, I've got some servo gears to rebuild. I need to order a new swash plate because, as I suspected, this sucker's not coming off this bent shaft. So rather than wait for all those parts and show you a little flight video, we'll call that a wrap on this, and I hope it was helpful in showing you how to replace the bearings in your main shaft bearing blocks. Thanks again for watching.